Hello and welcome to Season 8, Episode 9 of Bad Gays, a podcast all about evil and complicated queer people in history. My name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
And I'm Ben Miller, a writer and historian currently at work on a biography of the fashion designer Rudy Gernreich.
So last week we talked about the 19th century lesbian and landowner and lister. Who are we talking about this week, Ben?
Well, we're staying in the 19th century, Hugh, and we're staying with lesbians. In the year 1878, a woman named Adele Spitzeder published the story of her life. She began her memoir thusly. These are all my translations from the German. How much has not been written about my person, about the so-called Dachauer Bank, and about my sensational trial, without the borders between truth and distortion being to some extent respected. What one writes, the other repeats without thinking, and the biographies and the news reports about me make rounds around the civilized world, and not a single person thinks it's important to separate wheat from chaff or to research how much distortion is at the source." End quote. Now, news of Adele's exploits had traveled around the world since her spectacular arrest in 1872. That year, authorities in Munich finally managed to close her 3-year-old Dachauer Bank, which since its opening had amassed deposits of 38 million gulden, which is the equivalent of more than 500 million euros in today's money.
Oh, wow. So by her bank, you don't mean the bank that she used, but you were talking about a bank that she owned?
I mean, a bank that she created from scratch, and in 3 years, she had 500 million euros in supposed deposits.
Wow.
She was, by most accounts, the richest woman in Bavaria. But when authorities closed her bank, her depositors learned something shocking and unpleasant, which is that they had become victims of the world's first Ponzi scheme.
I was going to say.
Authorities alleged that Spitzeder paid her high interest rates, and we'll hear just how high they were later, by simply paying new deposits out to old customers. Possibly more than 30,000 customers in Munich were affected by this unbelievable scam. So Adele Spitzeder emerged out of the theater and opera world of the early 19th century. Her father, Josef, was born in either Bonn or Kassel between 1794 and 1796, and he was the grandson of a tenor named Franz Anton Spitzeder, who had premiered some roles in Mozart operas and actually worked with Mozart. Josef himself was a so-called buffo bass, a kind of comic character, think a little bit panto. He also specialized in Mozart, including Papageno and the Magic Flute, the Le Servant Leporello in Don Giovanni, and the part of Osman in Mozart's The Abduction from the Seraglio.
This is bringing together both your interests, Ben, fraudulent lesbians and opera queens.
Yes, exactly. Opera and financial crime. His first wife, with whom he had often sung in Vienna, died in childbirth, which was not uncommon at the time. His second wife in 1831 was another opera singer named Betty Vio. This was Adele's mother. And Hugh, I need to show you now a picture of Betty Vio's hair because you need to react to this.
Okay,
So
I
take
love
a look
the
in the
name,
chat.
Betty Vio.
Take a look in the chat.
Oh, wow. It's like a Frank Gehry building.
It really is. It's remarkable. This is,
So
I guess, what
she's got, like, for the listeners at home, she's got these sort of huge vertical curls, and then on top, again, sort of going almost like a fin from right to left, more sort of enormous. I mean, they look almost the same height as her head again, you know?
it's the RuPaul theory that you need to have one head's width of hair on each side of the face.
And above.
Exactly. So Vio was the daughter of an Italian nobleman, and she began performing at the age of 5 in her native Dusseldorf. Now, she became the singing pupil of a composer named Antonio Salieri. And if you've seen the really terrible movie Amadeus, you'll think of Salieri as this sort of tortured, known inferior to Mozart. Salieri was actually a respectful acquaintance of Mozart. They were actually friends. And the rumors that he had poisoned his friend due to jealousy drove him later in his life to a nervous breakdown. So these were always scurrilous rumors, and I find it really inexcusable that long after his death, they were popularized again. It's pretty rare that I want to sit down and listen to Salieri's music, but you do have to admit he taught a whole lot of really influential and important composers, including Franz Liszt, Franz Schubert, and Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, Betty Vio made her singing career beginning in her late teens, and she was a specialist in a kind of roles known as the Inas and the Ettas, because all the characters' names end in either Ina or Etta. And you can imagine that the Inas and the Ettas are pert soubrettes, lifelong virgins. It's like the old Oscar Levant joke that he knew Doris Day before she was a virgin. An 1837 source describes Betty Vio as, quote, the comic singer par excellence, who in the naive and lively roles, supported by a light, graceful, and agile figure and a pleasant voice, unfolds the richest, most natural commentary. Born 1807, she trained as a singer in Italy and went from there to Vienna, where, guided by her mother's wit at a happy hour, she found the genius of genuine mirth in the merry crowd of the cozy imperial city, and through her naive pouting, forced the boy god to teach her his amusing secrets, which she now smilingly shaped as his smiling servant on the stage and communicated to the friendly, eavesdropping crowd in light melodies. End quote.
They don't make them like they used to.
They don't. So she marries Spitzeder in Berlin, and then the two of them went to Munich. They often played opposite one another in the same operas. And when Adele was born on February 9th, 1832, she joined a family that included 6 half-children from her father's first marriage. And all of these children had to be supported on singers' salaries, which are then as now irregular. And so for this reason, when the Bavarian king Ludwig I offered Joseph and his wife the great big salary of 6,000 gulden a year if they offered their services exclusively to the Bavarian National Theater, they took him up on the offer. Now, at this time, Germany is not yet unified. It's made up of hundreds of tiny kingdoms and fiefdoms. Some of these, like Prussia or Bavaria, were large. Others were just a single city-state ruled over by some local noble. This so-called confederation had replaced the so-called Holy, so-called Roman Empire after the Congress of Vienna, and in the early 19th century, reform movements and liberals were trying to add parliaments and constitutions to these monarchies, and in response, conservatives were introducing censorship, maneuvering to block parliamentary assemblies from being formed. The most successful blockage was in Prussia. Liberals challenged conservatives with new ideas about individual rights. Economic changes transformed Germany, right? Large-scale industry begins to spread. A middle class is forming, growing rich from economic activity. A working class is forming, growing poor from the theft of their surplus labor. A communist movement is forming, seeking to organize that working class as the agents of history. The revolutions of 1848 failed and were put down. In their failure, royals maneuvered to control Germany. This is the environment in which Adele is born and growing up, right? She moved to independent Bavaria as an infant, an independent kingdom which played off its divided loyalty between Prussia to the north and Austria to the south. Bavaria is Catholic and rural. It was less industrialized than the Protestant Prussian north, and it has similarities with Austria that it could always use to try to play the two powers off one another and remain independent. So the pair arrive in Munich with baby Adele and the 6 older children, and suddenly, from a sudden illness, Joseph died when Adele was not yet a year old. Now, it's important to recall how totally without any kind of labor or welfare protections a freelance artist in 19th century Germany was, right? They had no jobs, they had no contract, they had nothing. So to the personal tragedy of his death is added this profound financial instability. And I think it's interesting to think about what this would do to the psyche of someone growing up in this world, right? If you're constantly going from contract to contract, from theater to theater, scrambling. As you'll see, they scrambled pretty well, but there's no security, right? How would you think about value? How would you think about money? Would you sort of think that money is this magical thing and it all ends up coming out right in the end, rather than thinking in terms of stable incomes? Who knows? It's worth thinking about. So until the end of the 1835 to 1836 season, Betty continued her contract, her half of the contract, singing in Munich. In 1837, when Adele was 5, Betty married a man named Franz Maurer, and she moved the family to Graz, another city in Austria. Now, despite their insecurity, as I said, the family did live pretty decently financially. Quote, my mother, I'm now quoting from these memoirs of Adele again, my mother, who continued to follow her artistic path, left her daughters, including her half-daughters, to be raised in the best style, end quote. King Ludwig himself, Adele reported, had taken responsibility for the sons. Another tragedy befell the family when her sister Josephine suffered an accident. A building under construction collapsed on her during a walk, and this left
Oh
her
my
with
God.
permanently damaged legs that caused her to, in Adele's words, quote, miss out on the most beautiful hopes of life, end quote. Presumably that means marriage and children.
Mhm.
Then she had a half-sister named Catherine, and we can speculate a lot about what these two thought about each other based on the way that Adele describes her in the memoir. I'm just going to read it, and you tell me what you think. Quote, she was a great beauty and made her career on the stage. Her total lack of talent meant she did not have a bright career there, despite the more favorable proposals initially made to her because of her famous name, end quote.
Brutal.
Her total lack of talent. Another sister she seemed to think more highly of, she wrote, quote, my second sister, Henriette, named Henriette Sonntag, had a huge talent and a beautiful instrument. She was engaged in the city of Neustrelitz and became engaged to a local noble, Adolf van Zieten, who had dedicated himself to art against the wishes of his parents. They now live happily in New York, where they moved along with my sister Josephine. My brother Gustav died at Augsburg at 27. Another brother, Wilhelm, also died. My older brother, Georg, a court reporter at the Munich State Court, is soon to enter pension, end quote. So, as I mentioned, when Adele was 5, Betty married this man, Franz Maurer, and that turned out to not be a very good idea. Adele wrote, quote, I was too young to give murky thoughts room, but I had an instinctive aversion against my stepfather, as though I could feel how unhappy he would make my poor mother. It turns out that Maurer had posed as a successful factory owner, but he was actually in huge debt, and all of her mother's savings were claimed as community property to pay those debts. All that was left to her mother was a rent of 500 gulden a year.
Okay, so it's like a series of tragedies befalling this poor woman, Betty Vio, no?
Yes. And yet, she seems to be one of these types, like the mother in Postcards from the Edge or something, who kind of thrives in the middle of crisis. Like you see her, the way that she's written about in the memoir, she's somewhat absentee. She's doting, but she's a little bit distant. And so when this happens, her mother just gets another job, now a little bit too old to sing, but she gets a job as a comic actress at the Karltheater in Vienna and gets a big, nice salary and lives very comfortably until the end of her life.
Okay, so she's a survivor.
She is a survivor. Yes, she's a true diva survivor in that sense of the word. But you might get a sense here that Adele feels maybe that she's been swindled out of savings or a class position that she's owed, right? From savings of, tens of thousands of gulden, you could have a few hundred gulden a year as income stably, right? And now Adele isn't going to inherit that, right? So from a young age, Adele was what we might call a tomboy. I'm now once again going to quote from her memoir. Quote, I played most happily with boys. I hated every feminine contact. My greatest pleasure was running around in the street and following the carriages, sitting backwards on their steps and driving through the whole town. My desire to see new things and my love of variety made me disregard the danger that this new way of exploring the streets of Vienna entailed, end quote. So she's literally running after carriages, jumping on the back where no one can see her and just sort of riding wherever they go. She started smoking tobacco at a very young age. You'll be shocked to know. She's a lifelong lover of cigars. She got into scrapes. She ran away. She was educated in a Viennese girls' school with, at least as she recalled, princesses and countesses, but she said, quote, I learned almost nothing, end quote. She was then transferred to the school run by the Ursuline convent, and after that she first studied singing and then decided to act instead. She trained with actresses named Constanze Dahn and Charlotte von Hagen. And at the age of 25, rather old actually for those days, she made her theatrical debut. This was in Coburg in the role of Deborah, and she modestly recalled taking 4 curtain calls after her performance to a packed house. A few days later, she debuted as Mary Stuart, quote, also just with 1 rehearsal, and in which I achieved, if possible, an even larger success, particularly in the garden scene, during which storms of applause interrupted the play.
So she's an actress, not an opera singer.
An actress, not an opera singer. Now, a debut this successful might have been expected to lead to a contract or a big stage career, and Spitzeder in her memoir had some excuses as to why it didn't. Quote, "Because an actress of my specialty, Gretchen Ehrenbaum, was already engaged at the Coburg Theater, my performances were always contractually limited," end quote.
Do we think that she's bigging herself up here and actually she wasn't as amazing an actress as she claims?
I think we'll see what we end up thinking of her stage career, but
Okay.
let's get through her own description of it first. From there, she went to Mannheim, where she guested with success. She wrote, from Mannheim, she went back to Munich, where she was engaged by the then intendant of the Munich Court Theater, a man named, get ready for an alarmingly German name, Hugh, Herr Dingelstadt.
Of the Munich Dinkelstadts.
Of the Munich Dingelstadts. So while she's working for Mr. Dingelstadt, something happens which I think you as a cat owner will particularly appreciate. Quote, "In the first scene, when the chorus dragged me out and shouted, 'Where is the Jewess?' a cat suddenly rushed down from the soffits, ran around the stage like a madman, and naturally caused great unrest in the audience. However, far from being frightened by this, I continued to play with great calm and earned the full applause of the house," end quote. This is now how I'm going to describe it when Fauno breaks into our recording session and, you know. So from there, it was off to Brno, where she once again celebrated success, but once again had all these reasons why it was only as a guest performer. She wrote, quote, "I also made the acquaintance of a young infantry officer, Baron von V., who formally proposed to me. I declined, for I had no inclination to make a commitment, even though I had friendly feelings for the young man," end quote. So her theater career continued, once again to Mainz, once again to Munich, and so did her lifestyle. So Adele was known in her theater career as a masculine woman. In fact, some critics said that she didn't have a big career because she was too masculine looking or masculine in affect for the stage tastes of the time. Her mother actually, perhaps for this reason, perhaps others, was dead set against her career, and her mother offered to pay her 50 gulden a month for life if she ended her acting career. And she reported that she turned down a permanent contract in the city of Pest that would have offered her 3,000 gulden annually, which would have been a big success in her career, because her mother didn't want her to do it. Now, we can judge whether we think she loved her mother enough to turn down 3,000 a year for 50 a month, but that's what she says. But along the way, she also met another actress, Emilie Steyer, whose stage name was Emily Branzika. And the two entered into a relationship, one which goes unmentioned in Adele's memoirs except for the following, which is a report about her later trial. Quote, "Questions were then asked about the relationship between me and Emily Branzika and whether there had been an argument between us. The answer was, yes, they were together, but they did quarrel sometimes," end quote.
Okay.
Now, Adele, as I mentioned, was known as a bit of a spender, and she loved to live in hotels. She loved to live like a big star. She loved to have room service. She loved to have gowns. She loved to have cigars. She loved to invite her friends. She loved to pick up the tab. And she claimed in her memoirs that she didn't actually like any of this, right? She only did this because she was just such a nice person. And I quote here, "In the feeling of my friendship, I was self-sacrificing to the point of forgetting my own interests. And if the choice fell on the unselfish friend, I had to become the victim of my good nature. Unfortunately, this has been confirmed in many cases in my very eventful life, and I have had to experience that really I have become the victim of my great good nature. For my own person, I had few needs of any kind, and found no pleasure in an overly lavish toilette or an opulent table. However, in order to see my friends happy and cheerful around me, I gave away the most of everyone's money. I didn't know the value of money at all, so my doors were open to anyone and everyone, if they made any claims at all," end quote.
She was a saint.
She was a saint, truly. Now, biographers have taken a slightly more dim view, both of her stage career and of her way with money. The Neue Deutsche Biographie dryly notes that, quote, "lasting stage success was denied to her," end quote. And the Bavarian biography writes, quote, "After her hoped-through breakthrough failed, she returned to Munich in 1868, fully broke," end quote. So Adele in 1868, her theater career seemingly over, moves into a hotel in the Dienergasse in Vienna. She has at this point one dress, one raincoat, one pair of shoes, one coffee machine, one girlfriend, and one small dog.
What more do you need?
So times were tough for an actress with only 50 gulden a month in income. I remind you that Adele had never lived in her own flat. She had spent her entire life living in hotels, meaning that she had spent her entire life having all of her food prepared for her. Her lifestyle, writes the journalist Harald Freiberger, quote, remained that of a stage star. She lived in a hotel, she invited friends to dinner, no money came in, she fell into debt. Eventually, it was many thousands of gulden, and today 1 gulden is worth about 11 euros. Adele would pay one line of credit by obtaining another, and eventually the creditors were all at her neck. She turned, she would later recall, to her mother. Now, her mother said that 50 gulden a month pocket money for life was quite enough, and that if Adele continued on this path, she would end up in the poorhouse. Adele recalled that, oh horror of horrors, she was even reduced to doing some of her own cooking. Quote,
Oh my
although
God.
I had beforehand not even peeled a single potato, in the mornings I would buy the needed victuals and prepare them simply on a cooking apparatus whose lucky owner I remained friends with from earlier better days. I made my simple food. In the afternoon hours, I brewed a good mocha, smoked a cigar, and in the evening went with a girlfriend to a cheap restaurant and ate a frugal evening meal. But my great personal austerity and my growing now 24-footed dog family, she now has 6 dogs, awakened the highest in hospitality of the hotel owners, although I always paid on time. Sure, Jem. All these deprivations, she continued, would have quickly reached their end if I had given up my friendships and returned to my mother. But giving up friendships to avoid deprivation, that I could not do. It would be a violent blow against my own nature.
Why did she have to give up her friendships to return home to live with her mother?
Because her mother lives in Vienna. And her
Oh, okay.
mother presumably wouldn't want her hanging around with a bunch of like hot young actresses and smoking cigars all day.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
She's not exactly being a dutiful daughter at this point. Now, in her memoirs, she adds a charming dose of anti-Semitism to her depiction of her own indebtedness. She writes, quote, as the resources of my own creditor were running low, the good men sent me to the people of Israel, end quote.
Oh God.
It was the Jews, she reported, who had really run up her bills, constantly extending her credit only with huge interests, building her debt up. So within a year, she's tens of thousands of euros in debt. And she met on one fateful day in 1869, a carpenter's wife. They started talking. Now, Bavaria at this point is on the verge of unifying with Prussia. Momentous political change is afoot. The historian Dirk Schumann describes Bavaria in these years as, quote, living through a modernization push of huge scale that left enormous insecurities behind it. The loss in the 1866 war against Prussia, the mobilization of new voting groups in the parliamentary elections of 1868, in which Bavaria for the first time had universal male suffrage, an ongoing culture war, and the entrance of the territory into the new German Empire shook Bavaria's political system. Irretrievably perceptible for the Kleinen Leute, the little people, were the enormous economic upswing and the reforms of economic and social laws that attracted many migrants to Munich between 1866 and 1871. People were exposed to both huge risks and huge rewards. So she meets the wife of a carpenter in the Au, which was the working class quarter on the River Isar, and they started talking. They talked about modern times. They talked about how awful everything it was. They talked about the evil Jews. They talked about the stupid banks. They talked about how no one cared about the Kleinen Leute. No one cared about the little people. And Adele saw an opportunity. And so she lied to the woman. And she said, well, actually, I know all of these Jews are screwing us over, but I have this friend who's giving me 10% monthly interest on my savings. And if you want 10% interest on your monthly savings, you can give me your money and I'll let you in. I really shouldn't tell you, but I'll let you in if you'd like. So the woman decided she wanted in. And so they went first to her bank and then to Adele's hotel. The carpenter's wife deposited 100 gulden, and Adele promised to pay her back in full with 30% interest in 3 months. And as a token of goodwill, she sent her away with 20% interest right away. So none of the principal, but 20% interest. And thus, the Dachauer Bank, or the Spitzeder Bank, was born. What's interesting to me is that in her memoirs, she refers to her customers as believers, using the word Gläubiger that Christians in Germany would use to describe like believing Christians. That's the word that she uses.
Mm,
There is, in
wow.
fact, a spiritual quality to this. And as we'll see, it is genuinely unclear whether she understands herself as defrauding people or whether she doesn't. Like she did, but it's unclear whether she thought she was being fraudulent or whether she was sort of self-delusional or stupid or both.
And in naming the so-called investors as believers, is she making an explicit gesture there towards her sort of anti-Semitic beliefs and also the anti-Semitism of the time? So, like, is she posing this as like an honest Christian bank against the,
Yes, she is absolutely posing herself as an honest Christian bank against the evil Jews and the evil liberals, and we'll see much more about how that plays out later.
Mhm.
So just to go back to what she's promising 10% interest a month, which is 120% interest a year. Now, if you know anything about money, that is obviously insane. Like
Yeah.
the highest risk investment portfolio will not bring you 120% a year, never mind a savings account. Like when a few months ago or a couple of years ago, people could get 5 or 6% annual interest on their savings. That was like the best savings interest rate in decades, right?
Yeah.
10% interest a month on savings is not it. I mean, Bernie Madoff, just to give you a sense of the scale of what she was claiming, Bernie
Right. Yeah.
Madoff claimed he got you 10% a year, and that was too good to be true.
Yeah.
She's claiming 10% a month, which is way too good to be true.
This is
But
very similar to Marta Hannah, right? Who we also did an episode on a few years ago.
very similar to Marta Hannah. And just like with Marta Hannah, the people that she's working with, the people that she's appealing to, don't know anything about how capital works. She is
Yeah.
speaking to this new kind of person, which is a working class person or a lower middle class person who, for the first time in their entire family's lived experience, has paper money and they need to put it somewhere, right? There's suddenly a little bit of extra money, maybe at the end of the month.
Mhm.
They can save, they can think in these sort of financial terms, and they want to find some place to put it, right?
Right.
Now, these
New middle
people,
class.
well, not even middle class. Middle class exists. This is the lower middle class. This is like
Okay.
the upper elements of the working class. Is anyone in the working class who has a little bit of extra money at the end of the week or the end of the month.
Okay.
And these people in Bavaria at the time are very anti-Semitic. They have a deep mistrust of financial institutions, and they are very likely to trust someone that they see as being one of them.
Very similar to Marta Hannah, right? Who was also playing on these sort of nationalist sentiments and also these sort of petty bigotries, this anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Now, Harper's Weekly in 1873 gave a different story of how the bank began. They have her placing an advertisement in a Munich newspaper reading, quote, "A respectable lady desires to borrow 150 gulden for 2 months. She's willing to pay 10% monthly interest and can give excellent references," end quote. Now, it's possible that Adele also placed this ad in addition to other conversations. So she now had a few believers and a whole bunch of gulden, and the question became what to do with this money, right? She'd paid out the interest in advance. She now had some money to live off of, but she needed to figure out a way to pay off the remaining principal, which exceeded what she currently had, before she spent any of it on her living costs. And the solution that came to her mind was to continue advertising for new customers and to pay out with what she was taking in, i.e., a Ponzi scheme. So she began to spread the word. She began to place advertisements. Harper's reported that within a week, she had 50,000 gulden in deposits, most of them from poor communities in Munich, all through word of mouth. Her bank was known as the Dachauer Bank after the working class suburb of Dachau. And if you're thinking, do I mean Dachau like the concentration camp? Yep, it's that Dachau.
It's not my God. Okay.
Before the concentration camp, it was just a place. But as you'll see, there's some connection to the concentration camp that followed because Spitzeder played off of people's prejudices by portraying herself explicitly as a Christian rather than a Jewish financier. Eventually, she had 40 employees working for her in the hotel. By 1869, she officially founded her private bank. None of her employees had the slightest bit of training in accounting. Money was kept in big bags of paper money, and customers signed their name with an X.
Okay.
She never made any claim. This becomes important later. She never made any claims about what she was doing with this money. She did not say she was investing it. She never said anything about what she was doing with it.
She just said, give me it and you'll get a 10%.
She just said, give me it and you'll get the 10%. She never said what she was doing. And she never gave any securities. In other words, she never said your money is safe with me.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow this made people trust her more.
Wow. Okay.
So in her memoirs, she wrote that in the years, basically, that it was going, everyone got their money back. She said, unlike the Jews, I didn't make them wait in line. And she said, and people just kept bringing money back of their own free will. And the business kept growing. Soon she was taking in 50 to 60,000 gulden a day, which is
Oh my God.
700 to 800,000 euros a day.
Wow.
The trains into Munich were full of people bringing money in bags to give to her, to put into her big bags of money. The hotel kicked her out because there was too much foot traffic. And first she bought one house and then she bought another house. And she started sort of trading in real estate. Eventually, in 1871, she felt confident enough to sink her interest rates. Now, by the middle of 1871, she was offering only 8% a month or only 96% a year. Now, the problem is she always needed more depositors to pay off the interest owed to people who entered a few months ago. And as Dirk Schumann writes, quote, the illusions she had about her own situation could not be clarified by the court. In her memoirs, she speaks often about dark forebodings that were fulfilled, and more precisely of plans to further reduce interest rates and come to terms with her believers, which may also be a subsequent attempt at justification, end quote. So her business ended up being operated from a very fancy house in 9 Schönfeldstrasse near the English Garden in the fanciest district of Munich. Of course, the house was entirely paid for with customer deposits. 83 employees worked from her house. She paid brokers a commission for new customers at this point because she constantly needed new customers to come in. She needed just vast numbers of new customers. By the beginning of 1872, she was the richest woman in Bavaria. Now, she set up her post in the house in full view of all the customers, and she would sit as they sort of came in lines to deposit their money, wearing a giant cross around her neck and a red nightgown, signing the promissory notes, i.e. depicting herself as this almost religious figure.
Right.
She used customer money to buy food and drink and entertainment for customers while they waited. She opened soup kitchens in collaboration with local Catholic authorities, which meant that the church favored her and actually helped protect her and bring her new customers. So the Catholic Church was in on this. The liberal Munich newspaper, the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten, attacked her relentlessly. But the conservative and Catholic newspapers, one called Der Volksbote and the other one called, get ready for this one, Hugh, Das Bayerische Vaterland. You'll never guess what they did in response to her critics.
They smeared them with anti-Semitic smears.
They smeared them with anti-Semitic smears, indeed. And by the mid of 1872, she'd actually bought 2 of those newspapers and started several of her own. And she used all of her newspapers as a way to bring in many, 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 many new customers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with her customers, she was extremely rude and direct. Here's a quote of a thing that she would apparently regularly say as people are standing in line waiting to give her money. Quote, you calves heads, I'm telling you right now that I'm giving you absolutely no security for your damn money. I didn't call you lot in here, end quote.
What?
But the rudeness meant that people would actually beg outside the door to be allowed in to give her more money.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird that sort of I guess like if you, because that's not what a fraudster would do. A fraudster would reassure you the whole time. So
Exactly. Now, because she kept paying out to customers, because no one had actually lost the money that they had put in yet, authorities could never find ways to intervene. The first blow was that after a long legal battle in 1872, a Munich court ruled that she actually had to register this as a business, which meant she was doing this entirely without any registration. And they ruled that she actually had to register this as a business. Once you register as a business, you actually have to file your books someplace. And given that there
Right.
were no books, that's why she was fighting against this. Her bank was growing, though, to the point when, so there's the system that still exists in Germany called the Sparkassen. They're
Mhm.
these local government-controlled savings banks, and instead of a national alliance, it's a Berlin Sparkasse, regional things, and they're government-controlled, very boring savings banks that make very boring
Mhm.
local investments and have very, very secure deposits. It's one of the actually reasons why Germany was less hurt by the financial crisis than, say, the UK or the US, is that
Mhm.
consumer banking is much more separated from other kinds of banking in Germany. That
Right.
legislation is pretty strong. The Sparkassen were starting to go insolvent all over Bavaria because their customers were pulling out all their money to
Yeah.
invest with this woman instead. And so in the fall of 1872, the state, which was faced with having to cover the losses of all of these Sparkassen, really started cracking down. They started placing ads discussing Spitzeder's lack of accounting. But as the state and liberals attacked more, her newspapers just got even more anti-Semitic, attacking, quote, the domination of Jews and Freemasons, end quote. And that historian Dirk Schumann writes, quote, you can only give her so much credit. It was the populist Catholic press that brought the masses to her door, that got her going, and that gave her power, end quote. And he sees in her case a conflict between these new economic opportunities available to the Kleinen Leute, to the little people, and a complete lack of knowledge about how to engage with them, right? And it's not their fault. The people that are investing with her they never had any chance to develop financial literacy, as you
Yeah.
might think, right? Now, finally, under all of this pressure, with enough people starting to doubt, the wave, and of course, you also need an accelerating number of new entrants, right, to keep this
Yeah.
going.
Because
The
it's a
wave
pyramid.
finally, the wave finally broke. And in November of 1872, Spitzeder started running low on cash. And so she started by doing something that's always a great sign when your bank does, which is limiting withdrawals to the hours of 6 to 7 a.m. and only on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. And this prompted some customers to go to the police and to start demanding their money back. Now, in the middle of her scam, Spitzeder had a huge fight with Emily Brunziga, her girlfriend. And so what she did was she placed a newspaper advertisement for a, quote, Gesellschafterin, or a lady's companion. Now, this was absolutely code at the time for a kind
Okay.
of Boston marriage. And there were many, many applicants because when she put this out, she was one of the richest women in Bavaria. She
Yeah.
selected, apparently based on a photograph, a young French woman who showed up. And by all accounts, the young French woman didn't get what the code was. And as rapidly as she moved in, ran away. So Adele's next target was a young woman who lived next door and whose name was Rosa Ehinger. Now, Rosa started working in the bank. Adele showered her with gifts, including, by the way, 50,000 gulden in cash, so like 700,000 euros, that when the scam was discovered, she tried to sneak out past the cops who had taken the house over and keep because, she said, it was fair payment for having had her reputation destroyed by being connected in the newspapers with lesbianism and fraud. We stan a crafty queen. This is a femme with evil twink energy, right?
Yeah.
So it's early November of 1872. The authorities move in. They seize Spitzeder, they seize Ehinger, they seize the house, they seize the art, they seize the bag of cash, they seize the terrible books. And they start trying to figure this out. Like, what is going on? Because no one knows what's going on. And like in many of these situations, people assume it's a little more complicated than it is. It would never be possible to figure out exactly how much he had stolen, but every week the number grew. It was something like 38 million guilders, or 500 million euro,
Oh my God.
from tens of thousands of customers.
I mean, that could crash an economy almost.
The historian Johannes Nebel writes, quote, it is an insane amount, especially for the short period of time in which it was accumulated and only with word of mouth, end quote. Now, insolvency administrators were only able to recover through the sale of property and the bags of cash 15% of the total amount, which means that your average depositor lost 85% of what they had put in. And that's basically
Right.
losing everything. 3/4 of her customers were working class. Another fifth were lower middle class. And this is the really sad part of this story, there was actually a wave of suicide that followed
Oh God. Yeah.
the discovery of this. There was also a wave of press attention, of media attention. Much of it focused on sensational details about Adele and her lesbian lifestyle. The judge in her case made a huge deal about how she had lain breast to breast with other women. There was one sort of wag observer who mocked her piety and who wrote the following 10 commandments of Adele Spitzeder. Please enjoy them. 1. I am the goddess of the Dachau bank swindle. Thou shalt have no other banks before me. 2. Thou shalt not use the name Spitzeder in vain. 3. Thou shalt also bring money on Sabbath and Sunday. 4. Thou shalt honor me alone, my bookkeepers, porters, and other servants, so that you may live long and prosper on earth. 5. Thou shalt not kill your income, but carry it to my bank. 6. And this one's interesting. Thou shalt not commit unchastity, but shalt live as I do. Wink, wink. Right?
Wink, wink, yeah.
7. Thou shalt not steal when thou art observed. 8. Thou shalt not bear false witness unless I require it. 9. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, however ugly she may be. 10. This is the best one. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, oxen, bullocks, horses, or any other horned cattle. Nor shalt thou covet the payment of my bills of exchange, for every paid bill of exchange disturbs the happy man. End quote. What do you think of those 10 commandments?
Yes, yeah, brutal. I mean, there's obviously like a very lively publishing sort of culture at the time as well, right? So there must have been lots being written about her and lots of these satires and all sorts of stuff going on. You know, like this is clearly the major news story of the decade in Bavaria.
It's a huge and it's international as well.
Hmm.
Now, she's accused of accounting fraud, of embezzlement, and of profligacy. And she was convicted only of bankruptcy fraud.
Mm.
The reason why she was convicted of bankruptcy fraud is because she shoveled 50,000 gulden to her lover, Rosa Ehinger, before declaring bankruptcy. That was illegal.
Okay.
She was acquitted of fraud because under the laws of that time, her business did not meet the legal definition of fraud.
Because she never said, you'll get this money back.
She never said you'll get the money back. And she never made any false claims about what she was doing with it. She never said she was doing anything.
Yeah.
This is also the defense she used in her memoir, by the way. The defense she used in her memoir, that's why I said it's unclear whether she knew she was doing anything wrong, because truly, I mean, you'd think like she might have just, who knows? She was sentenced to only 3 years and 10 months in prison. She spent that time writing her memoirs. She was eventually released in poor health, and she had some former believers who I guess still believed. One of them, a new woman named Marie Riedemeyer, took her in and became her new girlfriend. She tried composing music for a while. She then made a grand return to the theatrical stage. Now, there were crowds that wanted to come and see her, but they were hostile crowds. They were crowds that were more interested in blowing at her with what became known as Spitzeder whistles than applauding her art.
What's a Spitzeder whistle?
A Spitzeder whistle was a special whistle that was made by one firm to sell outside the theater where she made her debut, her sort of re-debut,
Amazing.
so that you could blow on the whistle to mock her as she came out on the stage.
Yeah.
So police in various cities prevented her from performing. I'm not sure whether it's because she was considered to be immoral or because they didn't want riots. She then changed her last name to her mother's maiden name, Theo, and tried to perform undercover under that name. After releasing her memoir in 1880, she actually unbelievably started accepting deposits again for a while.
Oh my God.
But this time, she made it very clear to write on the note that she gave people that there was no security in the investment. Her and her girlfriend were actually arrested again, but the authorities decided that anyone who gave this woman money was too stupid to deserve any legal protection, and so they let her go.
Oh my God.
And so she lived a life of itinerant acting, borrowing from friends, 50 gulden a month from her mother, and some other minor swindles, until she died at the age of 63 in the fall of 1895 of a heart attack. And that's the life of Adele Spitzeder.
Hi, you're listening to Bad Gays. We're an audience-supported show. We don't have a network, we don't have sponsors or advertising. It's really you guys who keep the show on the road. So if you're interested in supporting us, why not head over to Patreon, where you can listen to Extra Bad Gays, our monthly podcast about all things queer.
It's really fun to do. You get to hear from us every month. You get to hear from us in a less scripted format.
We're starting to do fun new things like an advice column segment. Again, all of that is only for subscribers. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts right there in the app. We also have new merch for season 8. We have t-shirts, we have socks that say Evil Twink Energy on them. We have caps in pink and camo and black. Go check it out, all at our website at badgayspod.com. All of that helps us keep the show going and do more of this, which we love to do.
And now, on with the show. Wow. Thanks, Ben. What a great story. It has kind of everything. It's, tragedy, comedy, farce, opera.
Yeah. First is tragedy, what is tragedy, comedy, and farce at the same time? Opera.
Yeah, exactly. So in her autobiography, in her memoirs, is there, you mentioned this idea that she maybe potentially believed, that there was some sort of spiritual aspect to this. How did she know that what she was doing was fraudulent? Does she display any remorse for the lives lost and the sort of, savings squandered? How does she conceive of herself in a sort of a moral framework?
It's hard to tell, right? Because a memoir like this that's written by a public figure is not actually a look into someone's head, right? It's an ego document, and it's about how she wants to be discussed and remembered. Right. She maintains in the whole thing that she would have figured it out eventually. Okay. And she seems to have been, the way that she speaks about finances and money betrays absolutely no knowledge of finances and money, right? This is not the case of someone who is a sophisticated financial operator creating a scam that they know to be a scam. Rather, it begins, I think, out of honest desperation. And then she might have known that she had to keep, and she could probably figure, it's not that hard to figure out that you keep needing new people to come in order to keep the money being paid out. But that might feel manageable. And in fact, it was for a couple of years, right? I think the fact that she felt the need to kind of buy newspapers and start really promoting it in that way, and to start having attacks on her attackers, I think that betrays a little bit of knowledge that something was kind of funky, and that she really couldn't allow anything to happen that would disturb her reputation or that would stop people from putting ever more money into this. But, at no point does she demonstrate particularly much remorse. She seems to think that basically, the authorities are the ones who screwed this all up, right? They shut me down, and that's why all this money was lost. And, I would have just had people continue to pay in, and then, everyone would have just been making 10% forever. Exactly.
I mean, this is the thing with a Ponzi scheme is there's no off ramp as soon as you start it, even if you've just done it twice. You either fess up and face the consequences, which might be extremely serious. Bernie Madoff is an example here. You'd be jailed for the rest of your life, or you keep going. There is no way to close it. It's open. It's an open-ended leak.
Right. And she started it at a moment when she could not get credit from anyone because she was so indebted, right? She started it, and she was already at a moment when her back was up against the wall, and she was facing basically having to give up her entire queer life and go live with her mother. And that, I think, is really interesting, right? That aspect of it, that she says, and this part I actually believe her on, right? She says, I could have found financial security at this moment when I was in Munich, and I didn't, because I would have had to give up my friendships. And I think what she means by give up my friendships is give up being a mannish woman who smoked cigars and had girlfriends. That's what I think she means. And I think I'm not crazy to believe that. And
no, that makes a lot of sense.
This is someone who's willing to swindle millions of people in order to continue being able to live the way that she wants to live, which is, in its own strange way, I won't say admirable, but she certainly took it to the hilt, didn't she?
Yeah, you're into it. Yeah, that's the other sort of question. Like, does she? How? You it's clear that obviously she had partners who are women, but does she sort of discuss any? I mean, I guess as you were saying, this is an ego document. This is an attempt to exonerate herself and her public image and to launder her public image. So I can imagine what the answer is here. But does she make any sort of hints towards more explicitly, like the fact that she is a lesbian and that it's all coded?
No, I mean, when she says I was a tomboy, when she says, then I would smoke my cigars, when she all constantly talks about having a Gesellschafterin, like a lady companion with her, like, it's not particularly hidden in the memoir. She's not writing in the memoir about how, she's met a boy and her heart went pitter pitter pat. But she is not, writing and then I
She's
had
no
sex with
unlister.
my girlfriend. She's no end-lister. No, there's nothing of that sort.
Yeah, yeah. But on that note, do you think there's like, as you said, like there's this desire to keep her queer life afloat and not having to move back in with her mother? But do you think there's also potentially a resentment towards the rest of the world? Like she's had a very hard upbringing, the bad stepdads, like this, like death, poverty, things like this. There's a kind of like a sort of queer nihilism going on of like, well, just fuck all of you. Or do you think stuff like the anti-Semitism is more ingrained, within her cultural upbringing as well? Like she wants to be a part of this world, or is she like just from the world? The world being, the Bavarian upper middle class.
Right. She is someone who grew up near and in the upper class, but she did not have the stability of presence in it, right? She's educated with noble children. Her mother is extremely successful at what she does, but in a way that doesn't leave behind a huge fortune. Adele has to make her own way. And her mother also can't support her forever, right? Like her mother has enough to live well for her life, but not enough to keep 6 children in a beautiful condition, right? So Adele is someone who is exposed to the very finest and the very best, and then can't quite earn it on her own. And I think that's where some of the resentment comes from, right? Like she's not someone who grew up poor and that is then living poor in Munich. She's someone who grew up very, very rich, went to these fancy schools, set out to be a great actress, did some, and then it didn't quite work out. And all of a sudden she's stuck. Where am I? Oh no, what's this?
Yeah.
This sucks. And it would suck, just to be completely honest, right? Like it would really suck to like go out and try to be an actress, and then it didn't quite work, and you had to suddenly like live in a kind of terrible, place with your, it would be awful, right? And now you don't. The answer to that is not to go out and steal 700 million euros, but you can have some sympathy for the fact that that she experienced this kind of downward mobility, right? Or that she was raised in a class position that she ended up not having the ability to keep herself in.
Well, who she reminds me of actually is Anna Delvey,
Yes.
both in terms of wanting to sort of maintain a sort of life that she's becoming accustomed to and doing that through fraud, but also because, like with Anna Delvey, she's doing on a large scale what the people who she's defrauding are doing on a small scale. She's greedy. But then the other people are greedy because they want the 10% a month, even though they know that the 10%, well, you're saying they don't know the 10% a month is not credible. But in the same way with Anna Delvey, like she's getting a lot of stuff because people think that if they give her a lot of stuff, they'll get a lot of stuff in return. And like Anna Delvey as well, I think like there's a degree to which she never gives securities, like what's Anna Delvey actually saying she is? For a lot of the things that she was defrauding people from, they just assumed things about her because they wanted to assume those things about her. And that's how the way the world works.
Right. I mean, I think the difference with Anna Delvey is that Anna Delvey's crimes were as much as crimes can be victimless, right? Like, I mean, the worst thing I think that Anna Delvey did, right, and it is that when she went on vacation with those women and stiffed them for this huge vacation that she claimed was all like paid for and covered, right?
Yeah.
Because there are stories of like a couple of the women who went on this vacation were not hugely wealthy. They're the kind of people who, as many people do, right, have friends who are better off and occasionally will go on a fabulous trip that a friend will pay for. But they're not expecting to suddenly get a $50,000 credit bill, right? And those are the people those are the stories about Anna Delvey where I really thought, oh God, I really feel bad for this person. Like that would be awful.
Yeah.
But
off these big hotels.
The financiers and the hotels and like the arty people, like all of those people, that's all victimless, right? Like none of those people, lost anything from that. The difference with Spitzeder is that her crime was not victimless, right? The people that she was taking money from did not have money, right? Like this was everything that they had. She was, I mean, and again, did she ever tell them your money is safe with me? No. Did she let them think that and put all their money into it? Yes. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess also some of their sort of investment decisions were also driven by their own bigotry, in the sense that they felt that they were being exploited by someone else, namely Jewish financiers.
Right. And it's also, there's a reason why people call anti-Semitism the socialism of fools, right? It's a bigotry that expresses something that would be much more politically productively expressed as something else, right? Some of the feelings that they're feeling, right? The feeling that financial institutions are not there for you. The feeling that the financial elite are not making their decisions with the interests of the majority in mind, right? Those are all true. They then assign that to Jews, and they ignore the entire historical background, anti-Semitic historical background, why Jews were disproportionately represented in finance at the time, right? And, create this whole conspiracy theory myth and end up aligning with the right in order to combat forces that the right is actually enabling and encouraging. And of course, that would never happen again in all of recorded human history. Certainly not right now.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
never would people, because of a conspiracy theory about big business and the people that are out to get you, throw all of their money into totally untested financial products that are just laughable the minute you start thinking about them. Never would that happen ever again. Certainly not right now. Certainly not right now with all of this crypto. That's all real. And
well, the point, of course, the point
we're going to issue the evil twink coin soon.
The point there, though, of course, is that in the end, they end up getting fucked over worse by the people who claim to be helping them.
Right. And that one of the best ways to really screw people over and to really convince people of your scam is to exploit their legitimate mistrust of the world's institutions in order to propose a solution that has nothing to do with the problems with the institutions, but because the feeling of mistrust has some legitimacy, right? The feeling that the system is not working for me is real. If you give them the wrong explanation for that, that's very powerful. I mean, that's how fascism, right?
Right. It makes a lot of sense to distrust and be very critical of the American healthcare system, but don't drink raw and pasteurized milk.
Right. And don't not get vaccinated because you think that pharmaceutical companies are screwing us over. They are, but you still want the vaccine.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. I think I know what you're going to say to this, but good gay, bad not gay, bad not gay.
The baddest gay that was ever a bad gay. The definition of bad gay, the kind of person we created this podcast to talk about, so firmly within our remit that I am amazed it took us 8 seasons to get to. Evil, lesbian, dastardly dyke.
Yeah.
Bad.
So if people want to know more about Adele Spitzeder, what are some of the sources you use? You said you translated some of her memoir into English, so I'm assuming that's all in German.
Yeah, so actually, I'm not going to list off all the sources right now because they're entirely in German. There's like 1 or 2 little things in English, but this is almost entirely an episode that I researched in German. So all the links are there for our deutschsprachige AnhörerInnen, but if you're not German speaking, they won't make much sense to you. I do want to give a special shout out to this article by Dirk Schumann, which is called Der Fall Adele Spitzeder 1872, eine Studie zur Mentalität der Kleinen Leute in der Grübderzeut. The Case of Adele Spitzeder, 1872, a study of the mentality of the little people, quote unquote, in the early years of the German Empire. That's in the Zeitschrift Bayerische Landesgeschichte from 1995. There's some newspaper articles. There's some stuff from encyclopedias. There's a whole bunch of these excerpts from these different biographical collections that different German historical associations have done, which I find really helpful. I wish they existed more in the Anglophone world, where there'll be like a short biographies of people that kind of link to one another, and you just can get a sense of who people are. Again, all of that is linked. The memoir is linked. The memoir is available for free to read on Google Books, and you can also listen to it through Bavarian Public Radio if you're a German speaker and you want to listen to them being read out loud. But again, it is 100% in German. So my service to all of you was translating this out of German. Not only, Hugh, are her memoirs in German, they're typeset in Fraktur, not in the Roman alphabet. But I've gotten really good at Fraktur.
Well, if anyone's going to, it's going to be you. Yeah.
I mean, my next problem is Kurrentschrift, which is 19th century German cursive, which is just a different alphabet altogether. It might as well be Cyrillic. mean, it's really
Okay.
impossible to piece out.
Well, on that note, you've been listening to Bad Gays. My name's Hugh Lemmy. You can find me online, hugh.substack.com.
And my name is Ben Miller. You can find me at Ben Writes Things wherever the internet is. And until next week, see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bad, 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 bad gays, bad gays.